Okay, so here we're going to look at sex-linked inheritance, and we're going to talk about how it's different than inheritance for our autosomal chromosomes. So we have sex chromosomes. In humans, those sex chromosomes are X's and Y's, but other species may use different chromosomes like Z's or W's. Okay, so in humans, though, our sex chromosomes, we have for females XX, and for males, we have XY. We can see that down here in the bottom right-hand corner of our karyotypes. So the way sex-linked inheritance is different than autosomal. Let's take chromosome number 2, for example. Up here, if we had like the allele for eye color, you would inherit 2 copies of that allele, one from your mom and one from your dad. But now, if we're talking about genes being inherited on the X chromosome, because when we talk about sex-linked inheritance, it really means genes inherited on the X. There may be a rare occasion where you'll see genes on the Y, but the Y chromosome is so small and only has about 30 genes, and they're not really essential for life because if they were, then the females would also have those genes. But the X chromosome has about 1,000 genes, and a lot of them don't have anything to do with developing into a male or developing into a female, like colorblindness, for example. So now what we can see here, though, in the difference between our autosomal chromosomes and our sex-linked is that females inherit 2 copies of the X chromosome, whereas males inherit only 1. So when we talk about inheriting 2 alleles, one from your mom and one from your dad, that doesn't work in sex-linked inheritance. So I'm trying to change slides here. Okay, so when we look at a female versus a male, let's go with the example of colorblindness. So colorblindness is a recessive condition inherited on the X chromosome. So if you're in a class like AP Bio, the pattern of inheritance or the mode of inheritance for colorblindness would be sex-linked recessive. So let's go ahead and see the difference, though, between males and females. Now, with a female, let's pretend we have a female who is heterozygous for being colorblind. Now, in reality, because colorblindness is recessive, we can see here, seeing all colors is dominant. Now, this female, she has this dominant allele, so she is not colorblind, but she does carry that allele with her. So if you ever see the word carrier, that's referring to a heterozygote who doesn't have the trait or doesn't have the disease or disorder, but carries the allele with her. And now, if the male is not colorblind, we see over here the dominant allele means not colorblind, so that's what he has. Now, you'll notice he does not have a second allele. He only has one X. So while a female can be homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive, that is not true for males. Males having only one X chromosome either have the trait or they don't. Like it's one or the other for males. There is no carrier and there is no heterozygote for males when dealing with sex-linked traits. I also want to point out, I think you've noticed maybe by now, that if we were talking about colorblindness, instead of writing it, let's say a heterozygote for colorblindness, we would not just write it like this. We actually will write it on the X chromosome, so it's more accurate to write it like this because that lets whoever's looking at your genetics problems know, oh, these traits are inherited on X chromosomes. These are sex-linked traits. Okay. So when we go on, let's do an example problem to see how we would solve Punnett squares in sex-linked patterns of inheritance. So let's use that heterozygous female from earlier. So she is not colorblind, but she is a carrier because of that recessive allele, and she's crossed with a non-colorblind male. So he can see all colors, so we know he has that dominant allele on his 1X. So we fill in our Punnett squares just as we did before with Mendelian genetics. So here's the X from the mom and here's the X from the dad. This will be a daughter who can see all colors. She is homozygous dominant and a female. Over here, we have the X from the mom and we have the Y from the dad. This is a son. So here you can see that the mother, the female, during Mendel's law of segregation, all of her eggs will inherit an X chromosome. Every single egg will have an X, and it is the father who 50% of his sperm will carry an X, and 50% of his sperm will carry a Y. Miles. And so there, when we look at what's happening here, it is the male who determines the sex of the offspring. Will the offspring be a female or will it be a male? It depends on what chromosome is carried in that sperm that leads to fertilization. So over here, though, let's go ahead and see. Here's the X from the dad, and here's the X from the mom. You may be wondering why I wrote the green one first, and it's really just because that's the dominant one, and the dominant's usually written first in a heterozygote. And now here we have the X from the mom and the Y from the dad. So when we interpret this Punnett square, we can see that half of the offspring are female and half of the offspring are male. So there's like a 50-50 chance of having a son or a 50-50 chance of having a daughter. But really when it comes down to, let's look at colorblindness. Now here, there's a 0% chance of having a daughter who's colorblind. Now why? Well, it's because the dad here has that dominant allele, and every single one of his daughters will inherit it, so it'll be impossible for a daughter to be colorblind from these parents. Now, when we look at their children in general, if you were just to see what is the chance that we'll have a child who is colorblind, well, only 1 out of 4, there's a 25% chance a child will be colorblind, but a 0% chance it'll be a girl. So now if you are specific to males, like if you were to ask what's the chance of a son being colorblind, well, out of the 2 options for sons, there's a 50% chance a male will be colorblind from this couple. Okay, so here's my last example. So let's say there's a colorblind female crossed with a male who can see all colors. So when we fill in this Punnett square, what we notice is pretty cool. So even though the mom is colorblind in this example, it is impossible for her to have a daughter who is also colorblind because the dad is giving a dominant allele to every single one of his daughters. So all of the daughters will be heterozygous. Now, as far as the sons are concerned, every single one of the sons will be colorblind. And that is because the X's are passed from the mother, the mother to her daughter. But when we talk about sons, the X comes from the mom and the Y comes from the dad. So if a mom is homozygous recessive for a certain trait, every single one of her sons will also have that same phenotype, will also be recessive for that trait because they don't have a second chance to inherit a dominant allele. If they did, then they would be female. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this. So here, there's a 0% chance of having a daughter being colorblind because the dad is donating this dominant allele to every single daughter. There's a 100% chance that a son will be colorblind because every single X that the mom can give is going to carry that recessive allele. Now, if you are in a class that is also doing pedigrees, this might be a sign that a trait is autosomal. Not autosomal, sorry. Sex-linked recessive, because here, like this would be this cross. If this female mom was homozygous recessive, you can see how both of her sons, they only get one X, and they both are inheriting that recessive X because that's all the mom has to give. Well, the daughters will also inherit that recessive X, but the dad does not have the trait. That means he has a dominant. I don't know why I'm using R's. I'm sorry. Oh, he has the dominant one. So every daughter will inherit that dominant allele. So I guess you could use B's. I don't know why I did R's. Okay. But anyway, so that is what is happening with sex-linked inheritance and how it's different. It really comes down to the males inheriting only one. Okay, great job.